The sharp edge of that termination letter didn't hurt nearly as much as the ice in his boss's voice. 30 years of sweat and loyalty had been reduced to a few cold sentences. Henry stood on the gravel shoulder of a lonely highway, his fingers white as he gripped a meager severance check in one hand and a black trash bag of his life's belongings in the other. The truck that had just pulled away took more than his tools, because it carried the weight of every morning he'd woken up before the sun for 3 decades. Meridian Automotive was the only identity he had left, and now, even that was gone. Management called it a necessary restructuring to handle market pressures and operational needs, but Henry wasn't buying the corporate script. He knew they'd simply erased his existence to pad their own pockets, and the pension he'd been promised since his first day had vanished into thin air. Instead of the security he'd earned through 30 years of honest labor, they handed him a check that wouldn't even keep the lights on for 6 months. With exactly $1 left in his pocket, he remembered the frantic whisper of a co-worker as he'd cleared out his locker for the last time. There was an old Pullman rail car sitting on a forgotten stretch of track about 20 miles outside the city limits, rusted through and completely abandoned. It was a relic of a different era that was now for sale for $1, and Henry realized he had nothing left to lose by taking it. That was the moment he made a choice that would ripple through the lives of everyone he'd ever worked with. He pulled into the rail yard while the world was still grey and the air felt heavy with the scent of wet iron and ancient dust. The Pullman car sat isolated on a spur of track that hadn't felt the vibration of a passing train in 40 years, its silver skin peeling away like dead scales. The windows were so thick with grime they looked like cataracts, and layers of graffiti from a dozen different decades competed for space on the metal sides. When the auctioneer looked at him, there was no pity or interest, just a quick nod as the hammer fell on his $1 bid. Henry walked up to the car and ran his calloused hand along the corroded metal, feeling the rough honesty of the rust against his skin. He didn't have a plan or a vision yet, but he knew he needed to keep his hands moving to prove that 30 years of skill still meant something in a world that had discarded him. The first week was a brutal cycle of stripping the interior and hauling out rotted cushions and the literal weight of 40 years of neglect. The smell inside hit him in waves of mold, copper, and a strange, sickly sweetness that seemed to be baked into the very fabric of the seats. He found a conductor's cap wedged deep behind a chair and a dinner menu from 1962. Small ghosts of a time when people travelled with a sense of dignity and destination. While he was scrubbing the floor, he noticed a section of wood that didn't quite vibrate the same way as the rest of the planks. The grain was slightly off, and the wood looked far too fresh to be original, which suggested someone had installed it with a very specific, hidden purpose in mind. Henry grabbed his pry bar and worked slowly, his mechanic's hands remaining steady even as his heart began to hammer against his ribs. He pulled back the wood to reveal a dark gap in the subfloor, and nestled inside that hole was a small, heavy steel safe. He spent the next 3 days hunched over the dial, refusing to use a torch or a sledgehammer because he wanted to solve the puzzle with the precision he'd used on engines for half his life. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, he felt a distinct mechanical click travel up through his fingertips, and the heavy door finally swung open. Inside sat a single leather journal, its cover stained by water and its pages yellowed with age, yet the ink remained perfectly legible. Henry opened the cover with trembling hands and saw the words, Meridian Automotive Company, Original Ledger, 1987 to 1995, written in a sharp, demanding hand. His stomach did a slow roll because he knew for a fact that Meridian wasn't supposed to exist as an independent entity back in 1995. The company had supposedly been swallowed up by a massive conglomerate in 1998. But these meticulous entries told a much darker story of what happened before the merger. He began to read through the columns of numbers, and a systematic pattern of theft began to emerge from the brittle pages. There were pension contributions that never reached the bank, and worker compensation claims that had been diverted into private accounts he didn't recognize. He saw the names of men he'd shared coffee with for 20 years, and on page 47, he finally found his own name written in black ink. The number sitting next to his name was $847,000, a fortune that had been stolen from him one paycheck at a time. Henry stepped out of the rail car and into the fading light, realizing he wasn't just holding a book, but the weapon he needed to get justice for every person the company had tried to bury. Henry spent the following week living out of the Pullman car with nothing but his phone and a library card to bridge the gap between his past and his future. Every evening, he made the long drive into the city to sit at the library's computer terminals during those quiet off hours when the staff didn't watch him too closely. The ledger entries were a jagged mess of codes at first, filled with abbreviations that didn't match any official company lingo and the count numbers that seemed to lead into a void. But Henry was a man of infinite patience, who had spent 30 years reading complex blueprints and tracing the hidden logic of massive industrial machines. To him, a ledger was just another system, waiting to be understood, a mechanical puzzle that eventually rewarded anyone willing to stare at it long enough. The pattern finally emerged from the fog, revealing that every single pension contribution had been siphoned into a separate account under the name Meridian Holdings LLC. 3 signatures sat at the bottom of every transfer, and while the names meant nothing to him at first, he eventually found them buried in decades-old business filings. The original founders had signed for every dollar, all 3 of them. Henry tracked down their faces in archived news articles from the 90s, where they stood, grinning in front of charts showing massive expansion and soaring profit margins. The company's reputation for efficiency grew every year they were in charge, but Henry realized that efficiency was just the word they used while they were picking his pocket. He stared at those smiling men in the grainy photographs, finally understanding that the life he thought he was building had been dismantled piece by piece while he was still working the line. One of the founders had passed away in 1999, and another died in 2015, but the third man, Marcus Reeves, was still very much alive and still running the show. Henry photographed every single page of the ledger, his hands shaking so hard he had to brace them against the table to keep the images from blurring. The library's printer was incredibly loud in the silence of the building, and each page that slid out of the machine felt like a heavy paper confession. Then the harder truth set in, because he realized the ledger wasn't just hidden, it was intentionally buried in a place they thought time would eventually erase. The Pullman car had served as the founder's mobile office in the early days, but when the company went legitimate for a big acquisition, they abandoned the car on a dead track to rot. The ledger stayed locked inside a safe that only those 3 men knew existed. Henry understood that the heavy book in his lap was no longer just a collection of old papers, but a weapon with the power to destroy the people who had destroyed him. He reached out to a lawyer named Sarah Chen, who specialized in pension fraud, and they met in a crowded coffee shop where the hiss of espresso machines drowned out their voices. Sarah's face went pale as she flipped through the photographs, her initial skepticism melting away into a look of genuine, wide-eyed shock. She held the printed images with a strange kind of reverence, as if the paper itself was made of gold leaf. "This is real," she whispered. "It's real," Henry said, his voice steady for the first time in weeks. Sarah laid out the reality of what came next, mentioning documentation and years of legal proceedings that made Henry's chest tighten with a sudden, sharp anxiety. He didn't have years left to give, especially not after he'd already lost 30 of them to a lie. But Sarah leaned across the table until her voice was barely a breath. She told him he wasn't just exposing a simple fraud, but was instead threatening an entire empire that could trigger a federal investigation and bring the whole company down. Henry nodded slowly as the weight in his chest shifted from the cold lead of loss to something that felt more like the heavy heat of a coming storm. Henry went back to the Pullman car and threw himself into the physical labor because he needed the constant motion to keep his mind from racing. While Sarah filed the preliminary documents and the legal machinery began to turn with the agonizing slowness of rusted gears, the weeks turned into months. He spent his days sanding the interior walls, stripping away decades of grime to reveal the beautiful, original varnish that had been waiting underneath the filth. The dust hung in the air like golden ghosts in the afternoon sun, and he spent his meager savings on salvaged Pullman parts from collectors who understood the sacred nature of a proper restoration. The car began to breathe again, transforming from a dark metallic tomb into a gleaming time capsule that actually felt like it mattered. But the beauty of the work was bittersweet, mostly because Henry could feel the world outside beginning to notice what he was doing. The phone calls started during the third week, beginning with a few unrecognized numbers and escalating until he was getting 5 or 6 calls in a single afternoon. Word had traveled through the underground network of retired mechanics who still met in greasy spoons on Saturday mornings to talk about the old days and the lives they used to have. They called to ask if the rumors were true, their voices cracking with a desperate kind of hope that made Henry feel like he was carrying the weight of 1,000 men. He couldn't promise them a miracle, but he stayed on the line and listened to every single story they had to tell. Tommy called on a rainy Thursday evening, a man who had worked the line next to Henry for over 2 decades and shared every lunch break and family milestone. Tommy's voice broke when he talked about his daughter's college fund, which he'd been forced to drain the moment his pension vanished into thin air. Patricia called 2 days later, explaining that she was 68 years old and still working a retail job she hated because her retirement had been stolen by men she never met. She had never planned to spend her golden years standing on a concrete floor for minimum wage, and the exhaustion in her voice was a heavy, physical thing. Henry started a spreadsheet of their names and their stolen futures, eventually sending the long list to Sarah with a note saying these were the people they were fighting for. Sarah replied almost instantly, telling him that these weren't just people they were fighting for, but the people they were fighting with. That small change in words made Henry feel like he wasn't standing alone on that abandoned track anymore. One morning, he noticed a dark car parked at the edge of the rail yard, and it stayed there for 3 days straight with a silent figure sitting behind the wheel. Henry didn't know if it was official surveillance or something more dangerous, but the sight of it made his stomach twist into a cold, hard knot. He moved the original ledger photos to a safety deposit box and backed up every digital file to a cloud account that Sarah could access if something happened to him. He was starting to think like a man who understood that people with everything to lose don't usually go down without a fight. The Pullman car was almost finished now, its interior gleaming with polished brass and wood that shone like a mirror in the fading evening light. It was a beautiful monument to everything the company had tried to bury, a quiet space where the secrets of 30 years were finally being dragged into the sun. Henry stood in the center of the car as the sunset turned the world outside to gold, thinking about the travelers who had once slept in these berths. He wondered if justice was a real thing that actually happened to people like him, or if it was just a fairy tale told to the desperate to keep them quiet. The answer came the next morning when Sarah called to tell him the federal investigation was officially open. Sarah laid it all out during their next meeting, her voice steady, but the air in the small office felt heavy with the shift in stakes. The FBI had officially stepped in, alongside the Department of Labor, and they weren't just looking at the ledger anymore. They were pulling every subpoenaed record Meridian had produced since 1995, hunting for every hidden transaction and mismatched account that didn't square with the company's public lies. The corporate response was a localized thunderstorm of aggression, as high-priced lawyers descended on the case like vultures over a carcass. 3 separate firms began flooding the court with motions to suppress the evidence, arguing with straight faces that the ledger had been obtained through illegal means. When Henry heard that word, illegally, his chest physically tightened, and he felt a sharp flash of heat behind his eyes. He had bought that car for $1 at a wide-open public auction, which meant he owned the steel, the dust, and every secret hidden inside the floorboards. Sarah tried to calm him by explaining that the company was just grasping at straws, but those straws were becoming incredibly expensive to fight. Meridian pivoted their strategy and filed a series of countersuits, claiming the ledger was a total fraud and that Henry had spent his time fabricating a forgery to shake them down. That specific accusation cut deeper than any of the legal threats, because Henry had spent 30 years being the man people could rely on. He was the guy who showed up, the guy who did the work, and now he was being painted in the press as a common con artist looking for a payday. The weight of those lies felt like physical hands tightening around his throat, making it hard to breathe in the very city he had helped build. Federal investigators brought Henry in for 2 separate interviews that felt more like interrogations, their tone professional but layered with a deep, practiced skepticism. They forced him to recount every minute detail of the discovery, from the moment he saw the car to the way he manipulated the safe without damaging the lock. They poked at his timeline and questioned his motives, searching for a crack in his story that simply wasn't there. Henry met every suspicion with quiet precision, because he knew the truth was the only shield he had left. Forensic teams eventually took the ledger into a lab where they treated it like a holy relic, testing the chemical makeup of the ink and the fiber of the paper. They found the ink was perfectly consistent with 1980s manufacturing, and the handwriting matched the signatures of the original founders down to the smallest tremor. The ledger was undeniably real, and the investigators finally began to move forward with a grim kind of confidence. Meridian didn't back down, though. Instead, they doubled their efforts to ruin him. They started leaking stories to business news outlets, framing the entire federal investigation as a political hit job fueled by an extortion scheme. Henry saw his own name in the headline for the first time, sandwiched between words like claims and disgruntled, which made his 30 years of service sound like a long con grudge. That word, claims, felt like a serrated blade because it invited the world to doubt his honesty. The fallout reached the rail yard in the form of anonymous hate mail from people who believed the company's propaganda about protecting jobs. One envelope had no return address and contained a single, chilling sentence telling him he should have stayed quiet. When Henry showed the note to Sarah, she didn't hesitate to call the FBI, and a detective named Chen arrived at the yard the very next morning. She photographed the paper and bagged it in plastic, then looked Henry in the eye and asked if he felt like he was in physical danger. Henry looked around at the rusted skeletons of the trains and didn't know how to tell her that he'd already lost his life's work, so there wasn't much left to take. Detective Chen didn't let it slide, though, and she set up a schedule for periodic check-ins to ensure he was still breathing. She warned him that intimidation is the standard language of a dying empire, and that they would do anything to make him blink. "I'm not backing down," Henry told her. But the words felt hollow even to him. A seed of doubt had taken root in his gut, and it grew a little taller with every threatening letter and every lonely night spent in the Pullman car. He kept working on the restoration out of habit, but the soul had leaked out of the project, leaving the movements mechanical and cold. He wasn't restoring a piece of history anymore. He was building a fortress to hide in while he waited for the next blow to land. The weeks stretched into months as the investigation snowballed into a massive web of tax fraud and money laundering that reached far beyond Meridian. It turned out the ledger wasn't just a record of one company's sins, but the key that unlocked a much larger vault of corporate theft. The call finally came on a Tuesday morning, leading Henry to a cramped office suite that smelled of stale carpet and hot toner. Sarah closed the door with a click that sounded final, and the look on her face told him the momentum of the last few months had just hit a wall. "The company wants to settle," she said, her voice dropping an octave. Henry felt a brief surge of relief that was immediately swallowed by a confusing mix of anger and disbelief. He reminded her that they had called him a liar and a forger for months, and he couldn't understand why they were suddenly folding. "Their own experts told them the ledger is bulletproof," Sarah explained, sliding a heavy blue folder across the desk toward him. "They know they'll lose at trial, so now they're just trying to buy the silence they couldn't win in court." Henry opened the folder and saw a number that looked like a typo. $127 million. It was a staggering sum, meant to be split among the cheated workers, with another $15 million set aside for the legal mountain they'd climbed. The deal even included a public admission of the pension fraud, which was the one thing Henry thought he wanted most. He stared at the page, thinking about how that money would change the gravity of his friends' lives. It meant Tommy could finally stop working on bad knees, and Patricia could finally open that bookstore she'd been dreaming about for 20 years. It was enough money to let hundreds of tired people finally take a breath. "What's the catch?" Henry asked, his eyes never leaving the paper. Sarah leaned forward, her expression tightening as she explained the non-disclosure agreement that acted as the poison pill in the deal. If he signed, the money would flow, but the ledger, the investigation, and the truth would all be buried under a legal gag order forever. Henry stood up and walked to the window, watching the indifferent city traffic crawl by below him. He thought about the silence they were trying to buy and the hundreds of workers who were counting on him for some version of justice. He wondered if it was really a victory, if the world never actually got to see the crime. "And if I refuse?" he asked, still looking at the street. "Then we go to trial, and they'll drag this out for a decade until the workers start dying off," Sarah said, her voice tinged with a grim reality. She paused for a second before adding that some of those workers had already passed away while waiting for this moment. Henry turned back, his voice a low rasp as he asked for the exact count of the people involved. 347, she replied. He sat back down, the weight of those 347 lives pressing against his shoulders like lead. He could restore their futures right now with a single stroke of a pen, but the cost was letting the company hide their faces. Sarah then slid a second, smaller document across the desk, and Henry's hands went numb when he saw his own name next to the figure of $5 million. It was a personal settlement just for him, a reward for finding the car and the courage to come forward. $5 million was enough to buy a new life, a new house, and enough distance to forget the humiliation of being discarded by the company. But it was a bribe, plain and simple, a high-priced lock for his mouth that would ensure the full story died with him. "Henry, this is your security," Sarah whispered, her eyes searching his for a sign of movement. "This is how you make your life whole again." Henry looked at the number, then at the lawyer, and then he pictured the Pullman car sitting out in the weeds of the yard. He thought about the hand-carved wood he'd spent months sanding, and the ledger that was currently sitting in a cold forensic vault. He realized in that moment that justice has a price tag, but it isn't always measured in currency. "I need time," he said, his voice barely audible. Sarah gave him a slow nod, and told him he had 48 hours to decide the fate of everyone involved. When Henry walked out into the afternoon sun, the sidewalk felt like it was shifting under his boots, and the noise of the city felt like a physical weight. He didn't go back to his apartment. He drove straight to the rail yard and climbed into the quiet wooden heart of the Pullman car. He sat there in the dim light, waiting for a clarity that felt like it was miles away. Henry sat inside the restored Pullman car as the blue hour faded into a deep, heavy darkness outside the windows. The mahogany wood gleamed under the soft interior lights, and the brass fixtures caught the last of the evening glow, making everything look polished and purposeful. It was a beautiful space now, but that beauty felt thin and hollow against the crushing weight of the choice he had to make. He picked up his phone and dialed Tommy. "They're offering to settle the whole thing," Henry said, listening to the ragged sound of Tommy's breathing on the other end of the line. "How much are we talking about?" Tommy asked. Henry whispered the number into the receiver, telling him it was $127 million. The line went dead silent for a long time until Tommy finally spoke, his voice cracking with a sudden, sharp emotion. "That's enough to fix it, Henry, because that's enough money to actually make things right for everyone." "There is a catch to the deal," Henry replied, and he began to explain the non-disclosure agreement and the forced silence that came with the check. It was money with a heavy price tag of invisibility. "So we take the cash, but we have to pretend none of this ever happened," Tommy said, though it wasn't really a question. "That is exactly what they want." Another long silence stretched between them, and Henry could almost feel the 30 years of struggle pressing down on both sides of the phone connection. He could hear the slight tremor in his friend's breath, a sound of a man who had been tired for a very long time. "What are you going to do?" Tommy finally asked. Henry didn't give an answer right away, because his eyes were fixed on the original ledger he had pulled from the safety deposit box earlier that day. The leather cover was scarred and worn, the pages had turned a brittle yellow, and the handwriting inside was precise, cold, and absolutely damning. "I don't know yet," Henry admitted. Over the next few hours, he called Patricia and 6 other former workers, and every single conversation felt like a mirror of the one before it. He watched hope collide with the steep price of that hope, offering these people financial security in exchange for their voices and their history. Later that night, he called Sarah back and asked what would happen if he simply refused to sign the non-disclosure agreement. Sarah stayed quiet for a long beat before she told him the company would likely pull the offer, which meant they would have to head to a full trial. "How long would that take?" Henry asked. 3 to 5 years, maybe even longer," Sarah warned. "And the reality is that some of these workers won't survive that long, just like some of them have already passed away." Henry felt the physical weight of those words settle in his chest. He spent the rest of the night alone in the Pullman car, listening to nothing but the low moan of the wind moving through the trees outside. He sat there thinking about legacy and the thin line between what a culture remembers and what it chooses to forget. He weighed the difference between actual justice and paid silence, picturing the faces of the people who had called him, their desperation, their flickering hope, and their bone-deep need to finally be seen. By the time the first grey light of dawn hit the windows, Henry had made his choice. He called Sarah and told her he was refusing the non-disclosure agreement. He heard her sharp intake of breath through the phone as she asked if he was sure about walking away from $5 million for himself. "I am walking towards something else," Henry said, and he hung up the phone before she had a chance to talk him out of it. He spent the entire day on the phone, reaching out to every worker he had a number for, telling them the settlement was real and their money was coming back. He told them the truth was finally coming out into the light. He spoke to them about the ledger and the decades of systematic theft he had uncovered within the network of companies. He told them they didn't have to be silent or invisible anymore. Those calls took until the sun went down and by evening, the story was moving through the community like a brush fire through dry wood. Former workers were already calling local journalists and reaching out to labor unions to start organizing. Sarah called him back to say the company was panicking and threatening to scrap the entire settlement. "Let them try," Henry replied. But the company didn't pull the deal. Instead, they came back with a different offer where the settlement would stand without the gag order attached to it. The workers could keep their money and they could tell their stories to whoever would listen. Henry agreed to the terms. Within a week, the story was headline news across the country, featuring a mechanic who had unearthed evidence of massive pension fraud from beneath the floorboards of an old train. The Pullman car became a landmark, a place where corporate secrets had finally been dug up and exposed. When the news crews arrived at the rail yard, Henry gave his interviews standing right beside the restored car with the ledger displayed in a glass case behind him. The wood gleamed in the afternoon sun, and for the first time in 30 years, the truth was visible to everyone. The federal investigation grew into something massive that spanned 3 different states within just a few weeks. The ledger became the primary evidence in multiple criminal cases, leading to the indictment of the CEO and 2 board members for conspiracy and money laundering. As the criminal trials began, civil lawsuits started to pile up, and that original settlement was just the beginning of the fallout. By the time the dust settled, the total restitution across all the linked companies climbed over $400 million. Letters began arriving at the homes of thousands of workers, containing explanations of back pay and numbers that meant their entire lives were about to change direction. Some people broke down in tears when they saw the checks, while others were just angry that it had taken a lifetime to get what was theirs. A few felt nothing at all, because 30 years of loss is a hole that money can't ever truly fill. Tommy used his portion of the settlement to retire immediately, and when he called Henry, his voice sounded steady and calm for the first time in years. He talked about wanting to spend his days with his grandkids and finally being able to breathe without counting the hours until his next shift. Patricia fulfilled a lifelong dream by opening a small bookstore in town, a place she had given up on ever owning. Henry went to the grand opening and watched her move through the shelves with the quiet grace of someone who had finally been given permission to build a life for herself. She hugged him tight in front of the crowd, and neither of them wanted to be the first to let go. Dozens of other workers used that money to stitch their lives back together by paying off old debts and reclaiming the futures that had been stolen. The money wasn't the same thing as justice, but it was a formal acknowledgement of their struggle. It was the proof they needed to show that what had happened to them actually mattered. Henry started receiving a kind of fame he never really wanted, with labor groups asking him to speak and filmmakers wanting to buy his story. He turned almost all of them down so he could focus on finishing the Pullman car, a project that took him another full year of labor. When it was finally done, he opened the doors to the public once a month for tours. He would walk people through the narrow hallways and explain the history of the car, the moment of discovery, and how the truth had been hiding under the floor the whole time. He spoke to visitors about how justice is often messy and incomplete, and he told them about the high cost of refusing to stay silent. He let people run their hands over the polished wood and sit in the restored leather seats, so they could understand this wasn't just a train. It was a monument to everything that had been lost, and the small part of it that had been recovered. The CEO of the company eventually received a 12-year prison sentence, while the board members were handed 8 years each. Even after they appealed the ruling, the convictions stayed in place, and the company was forced to restructure under new oversight. A portion of their future profits was legally diverted into a permanent compensation fund for workers. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was something real. Henry was 63 years old when the final court case was closed for good. He had financial security now, and a future that didn't depend on a corporation that had once thrown him away like trash. But the thing that sat heaviest in his heart was the simple fact that he wasn't forgotten, and neither were the thousands of workers whose lives had been derailed. One quiet afternoon, Henry stood inside the Pullman car all by himself. The light hit the windows in the exact same way it had on that first morning when he arrived with nothing but $1 in his pocket and a sense of total desperation. Now, the car was a masterpiece of gleaming wood and shining brass, restored to the beauty it had known a century ago. He thought back to the day he walked out of the office with his life in a trash bag. He remembered the fear that drove him to spend his last bit of money on a rusted-out wreck, and the moment he felt the cold metal of the safe hidden in the floor. He thought about the moment he chose to speak up instead of taking the easy way out. Standing there in the silence, he realized that this feeling was always the true destination. It wasn't about the money or the fame, but about standing in a space he had saved, holding a truth that finally belonged to the world. The ledger now rests inside a climate-controlled case at the rail yard, permanently open to page 47, where Henry's name and his stolen future are finally visible to the world. People come from all over to see those ink marks and run their hands along the restored wood of the car, realizing that justice is rarely swift or clean. By rebuilding that frame, Henry did more than fix a train, because he managed to restore the truth itself. As the door clicks shut behind the final visitor, the car settles into the evening silence, no longer a tomb for secrets,